So till now, we have seen what is try catch, how do we handle exception using try catch, and we have seen that how we can throw exception using throw keyword. And as I said that the very common question asked is what is the difference between throw and throws. So let's just try to understand throws, and obviously that will make the difference between the two very clear. So now let's say you have written a method print, and whatever code you have written inside the print can cause an exception. So either this could be an exception thrown by the Java runtime system, or let's say here itself, exception is thrown by the code. Now we have two options, that either we handle the exception inside print method only, or we throw exception to the calling method, whosoever has called this print method. So in first case, what we'll do is we'll simply have try and catch here, and I'll handle the exception, which means it's fine. Now in second case, when we are throwing exception to the caller, and it would be great if you could just tell the caller this particular print method is going to throw or might throw IO exception. So why don't you just be ready to handle it? So I'm repeating. Let me just write it down. So there could be a situation when a method can cause an exception which might not be handled by the might not be handled by the method, and we expect the caller or the calling method to handle the exception. In this case, we might want to inform the calling method about the exceptions that print might throw. So what is happening is, I am not handling IO exception here. I'm throwing it to the method which called print method, and that particular method should handle it. So I just want a way in which I can just list down the exceptions that print might throw. So whosoever calls print knows that okay, print might throw IO exception and I should be ready to handle it. So I simply need a way to list down the exceptions such that the method which is calling print knows that okay, this particular set of exceptions are going to be thrown or might be thrown and I should handle it. So this can be done using throws keyword. So in order to list down the exceptions that print might throw, we will have syntax something like this. We will have name of the function, we will have name of the method, keyword throws, and list of exceptions. So here we are just throwing one exception, so I'll just write down IO exception. In case there are more than one exception, we'll just put a comma and write down the list, or let's say there's one more null pointer exception, and I'll simply have the method body. Now here I want to tell you something, is that it is not necessary that this print will for sure throw these exceptions. It's just that the code inside the print might throw these kind of exceptions, hence we are putting this here. So we are just informing the methods who are calling print that okay, these are the exceptions that might be thrown, so make sure you take care of it. You either handle it or you rethrow it. So that is the use case of throws. In simple ways, throws is used to list down the exceptions that a particular method might throw. So if someone asks you the difference between throw and throws, a very striking difference is that throw is used to throw an exception on our own, and throws is used to list down the exceptions that a particular method can throw. Now let's just proceed further and see an example, and that particular example will take us to the discussion of checked and unchecked exception. Let's just proceed further and see that. So here, let's say I have main. I am creating a method print. Let's say this particular method print is throwing IO exception. So let's say I throw IO exception. Let me import it. Okay, so this IO exception is already imported. Now as you can see that you are getting a compilation error here. So what is happening here is that, let me see what is the error. The error is add throws declaration surround with try catch. So now what happens is that there are a kind of exception which are known as checked exception. So whenever you have a checked exception, whenever you have a method which might throw a checked exception, let me write it down here, checked exception, then either your code should handle it using try and catch, or it should have throws declaration just to inform the method who is calling print that this particular method will throw IO exception and make sure you are handling it. So hence we are getting this compilation error that either add try catch or add throws declaration. So let's say I go ahead and add throws declaration. So this is the use case of throws, as you can see. Now when I use throws here and I put IO exception here, and now let's say I call this particular method from main print. So now if you see here again, you are getting compilation error. So what is the error? Let's see again. So it says unhandled exception type IO exception. So now what's happening here is that print is throwing IO exception and this particular main method is not handling it. So you either have to handle it using try catch or using throws. So let me add just try catch here. So as you can see, now things are working fine. So we will discuss that why is this happening and what is checked exception, what is unchecked exception. Before that, I just want to show you another scenario. So let's say now we don't have IO exception, we have null pointer exception. So let me put in null pointer exception here. And let me remove this. Okay, so as you can see that in previous code, when we had IO exception here and we were not throwing it, or when we are not handling it, we were getting a compilation error. But here we are not getting any error, any compilation error. We are throwing null pointer exception and no one is handling it, and the compiler is fine with it. And let me tell you, this null pointer exception comes in the category of unchecked exception. So what is the major difference between checked exception and unchecked exception is that whenever your code is throwing any sort of checked exception, the compiler checks that whether you are handling it or not. If you are not handling it, then you get a compilation error. And obviously if you're handling it, it's fine. And you can do the handling either using try catch or throws. Whereas in case of unchecked exception, there is no such checking from the compiler. You handle it or not, obviously when you run it, you will get the exception, but during compilation, there is no such check. So this is a major difference between checked exception and unchecked exception. So let's just write it down again. Okay, so again, this is a very famous question, checked exception versus unchecked exception. So first, as we have already seen that checked exception is something whose handling is checked by the compiler, and it is necessary to handle checked exceptions using either try catch or throws, else you get compilation error. Whereas unchecked exception is something that is, or whose handling is not checked by the compiler. So now what comes under checked and unchecked exception? So all the exceptions that are not runtime exceptions comes under checked exception, and all the runtime exceptions like arithmetic exception, array index out of bound exception, these come under unchecked exception, and also errors come under unchecked exception. So these are unchecked exception. Now what comes under checked exceptions? All the exceptions that are subclass of exception class but are not runtime exceptions come under checked exception. Examples being IO exception, SQL exception, unknown host exception. So these are some kind of checked exception. Whenever you are writing a code, and if your code might cause any of these exceptions or any of the checked exceptions, there are other checked exceptions as well, then it is necessary that you either handle it using try catch or using throws. So when you are using throws and throwing the exception, then whosoever is calling this particular method or the method you have written should again handle it. That particular method should either handle it using try catch or using throws. So this is necessary, else what will happen is that during compile time only it is checked that whether this particular exception is handled or not. If it is not, you get compilation error. Now you might be wondering that why is that compiler is bothered about these exceptions, handling of these exceptions, but not these exceptions. So if you see that in this particular case you have a runtime exception, arithmetic exception. So let's say arithmetic exception is occurring because you're doing something like a by b and the value of b is 0. So this is something that you should take care of when you're writing the code, that b should not have the value as 0. Rather than just throwing this as an exception, you should be extra careful when you're writing the code. But in this case, let's say you are using a resource. In case of IO exception, you're using a file, let's say, and some exception occurs. In that case, if you are not handling that particular exception, it might happen that the file remains open, or in any of these cases when you're using a resource, outside resource, if that particular resource still remains open or still remains in use, that obviously will lead to misuse of the resources, or it might happen that lots of resources remain open, which will eventually lead to several issues. So it is really necessary that if any exception occur in this particular case, you handle it and maybe you close the file or you close the resource or whatever it is. So it is really necessary that you handle it. In case of runtime exceptions, these are something that needs to be taken care of while you're writing the code, and you have to be extra careful while you're writing the code. So this is something that is actually handleable while you're writing the code. Hence, it is not necessary to handle unchecked exception, but it is really necessary to handle checked exception. Hence, compiler checks it during compile time only. So that is the difference between checked exception and unchecked exception. Next, we are going to talk about two more stuff. We are going to talk about how to create our own exceptions, and we will talk about something called keyword finally. So till now, we have seen what are the different kind of exceptions, what are the exceptions, and how the exceptions are thrown by Java runtime system, and how we can catch them or handle them using try catch. Now let's say till now we have been handling exceptions that are thrown by the Java runtime systems. Now what do I want is that I want to throw my own exceptions. So many times what happens is that you write the code and based on certain scenarios you throw the exceptions. So just like what happened in case of Java runtime is that wherever something happened like divide by 0 or something, the runtime system realized that okay, this is something that is abnormal and we have to throw an exception here. Similarly, some things which might not be abnormal as per the runtime system but might be abnormal for you, you want to throw exceptions at this particular place or those particular places. So let's see, when you have to throw exceptions in your code, how you can do it. Let's say own code. Okay, so let's say I want to throw null pointer exception. So we can either throw predefined or inbuilt exceptions, or we can throw exceptions created by us. So or I can create my own exceptions. So right now I'll just talk about predefined exception. Going ahead, we will see how we can create our own exception. The way of throwing both the exceptions is going to be same. It's just that this predefined exception is something that we already have, but many a times these exceptions are not sufficient and we have to create our own exceptions. We can do that, and as I said, the way of throwing both the exceptions will be same. Now let's say I write a method static void, let's say print, and let's say it is accepting a parameter a. Now what I'm going to do is that if a is equivalent to 0, I just want to throw null pointer exception. Let's say that is my use case right now. So how do we throw exceptions? We throw exception using the keyword throw. So we throw exceptions using the keyword throw. So this is the keyword that you have to use, and you have to put in the exception that you want to throw. So here we want to throw null pointer exception. So we'll create an object of null pointer exception. let's say I pass some message here, exe. So now what happens is that this is an exception that is already defined in Java. So whenever you do this new null pointer exception exe, so we have seen this several times, what will happen is that a new object will be created, and the constructor of null pointer exception, which is accepting a single parameter, a string parameter, will get called. So this is what is going to happen. So this is how we throw an exception. I'll repeat, you just have the throw keyword and you have the object. So we could have created this object beforehand as well, and we could have thrown it, or here we are just creating the object and we are throwing it simultaneously. Now let's say we have thrown this particular exception. What is going to happen next? Who is going to handle it? Who is going to catch it? So we can catch this particular exception here only using try catch. So let's just put try catch. So the method of handling will be exactly same like we have seen till now. So we'll have a catch that is going to handle this particular exception. Everything remains the same for try catch, which we have seen. Or what we can do is, if let's say we don't have try catch here, we have simply static void print int a. So in this case we are not handling this throw or this exception in this print method. So what happens is that this exception now passes on or is thrown to the method that called this print method. So let's say we have main, and this main called this particular, it's public static void main, this main called this particular method. So now what we have to do is, the place from where this particular method was called, that has to be inside try catch, or the part of code where this particular method was called has to be inside try catch. So we simply have to do try, and we have to call print from here. Let's say I pass the parameter and we have to put the catch here and the relevant stuffs. So here we are handling this particular exception that was thrown from print. Now what happens if we don't handle this particular exception here as well? Obviously what will happen is that your program will get terminated, since we are not handling the exception, right? So this is how we use throw. So now we have seen two scenarios. One is here, that we are catching it here, we are handling it here. Another is that we are not handling it here, we are simply handling it here. One more situation could be that we catch it here and then we rethrow it. So there is something called rethrowing an exception. So what happens in case of rethrowing is an exception is that we catch an exception once and then we throw it again. So here what will happen is, we'll have try if a is equivalent to 0, we, let's say here we throw the exception, and then we have a catch block. Let's say I have the parameter here, I'll just simply, let's say, print out something, and then from here I'll throw the exception again. So let's say here I'm handling the exception as null pointer exception e. So now what I'll do is, I'll catch this particular exception here and I'll throw it again using the keyword throw, and since e is the object already here, I'll just simply throw e. So in this case again what will happen is that this exception will be thrown to this particular method, to this place where this method was called, and we have to ensure that we are handling it here properly, else again my code will get terminated. So that is about throwing exception. So now a very important or very common interview question that comes up is the difference between throw and throws. So we have seen that there is try catch, there is throw, and there is something called throws. So since these throw and throws are very much similar, students often get confused between the two. So let's just go ahead and try to understand throws as well, and make sure you understand it well so that you're able to answer it well in your next interview. So now let's go ahead and see what is throws, what is the use of it, and where do we use it.